Before you listen, if you enjoy the stories and want to hear more, then please consider subscribing. Most of you listening aren't subscribed, so please take this time to subscribe. Turn on notifications so you'll never miss a story and be the first to hear. You'll also be supporting me. Thank you. I really should listen to those little nagging gut instincts on the very first date with Rob. Maybe I was just lonely and vulnerable after another rocky breakup, or maybe I foolishly convinced myself I was mature enough to handle his love-bombing overtures. Whatever the misguided reasoning, I ignored all those internal warning lights flashing and let myself get caught up in the suffocating riptide of his over-the-top charm offensive. From that initial dinner, Rob didn't just pull out all the stereotypical moves to impress a new prospect. He went so wildly above and beyond that I genuinely started feeling uncomfortable accepting such premature deluge of grand romantic gestures. Fancy pricks fixed candlelit meals at the finest restaurants, arriving with obscenely overpriced bouquets of 24 long-stemmed roses, constantly trying to drape me in expensive jewelry I repeatedly refused. It was all just way too much, too fast from a guy I quite literally just met. But anytime I tried to politely tap the brakes on his flagrantly lavish peacocking, Rob would recoil and pout like a sad puppy who'd just been kicked, his hangdog eyes swelling with abject hurt and dejection. So like a coward who couldn't stand an ounce of awkward tension or uncomfortable conversation, I simply soldiered on and gave him chance after chance after chance to keep proving what a romantic he was. In retrospect, those were flashing neon signs I utterly failed to heed. That's when the texts and calls started flooding in at an utterly unmanageable pace. Good morning manifesto missives arriving before my eyes had even opened, live streams from wherever he was daydreaming and fantasizing about our future children's names or wedding song, or whatever delusional romanticized life script was looping through his addled mind that day. And inevitably, the 3 and drunken word vomit novellas would come pouring in, pleading and bargaining for me to be his forever, no matter how unrealistic or out of left field. At first, I believed I could set healthy boundaries and make him understand that level of round-the-clock obsession simply wasn't sustainable for a brand-spanking new courtship. But the more I tried communicating limits and ringing him in, the deeper he tumbled down his untethered rabbit hole. The turning point was when I finally worked up the courage to firmly end things, shake off his rewriting of reality, and make a clean break before utter codependency consumed us both. I'll never forget the sickening lurch of dread spotting his truck idling outside my apartment complex for hours on end in the dead of night less than a week after I thought I'd cut him loose for good. Those initial tearful voicemails and emails soon descended into a full cyber onslaught, a barrage of cringe-inducing poetic confessions shoved through every mail slot and windshield wiper, professing his soul was now cosmically tethered to mine for all eternity and bargaining to grant any wish my heart desired if I'd only give him one last chance. Just hearing his increasingly manic pleas reverberate while he stalked in the shadows made my skin crawl. It rapidly escalated into a pattern of straight-up stalking before long, Rob somehow remaining omnisciently aware of my every move and location through yet another multi-platform onslaught of demoralizing love notes. I have complete strangers and even long-lost acquaintances getting bombarded by deranged rants from him about our fated romance across every social media platform and phone line. No corner of my life left untouched by his escalating civilian harassment. Even when I think I was finally in the clear, I'd inevitably stumble across coded breadcrumb missives he'd left in the dark recesses of ancient internet comment sections and forums, just to remind me his gaslit spirit was eternal, vigilant, and never resting in its efforts to metaphysically manipulate me into submission. I started having to look over my shoulder every minute of every single day, jumping at any stray noise or unexpected vehicle pulling up, my nerves frayed by relentless paranoia that Rob's truck full of unhinged hope could suddenly appear idling across the street at any second, no matter how much I varied my commutes or laid fake trails, while some tiny part of me foolishly hoped he'd eventually get bored and distracted by shiny new romantic conquests. The terrifying reality soon became clear. His obsession was only calcifying and intensifying as the sting of rejection curled his fragile psychology down a rabbit hole of eternal fixation. Things eventually spiraled so completely out of hand, I felt forced to abandon my entire life, moving across state lines, ditching social media, changing jobs and phone numbers, going essentially off the grid like a hunted woman fleeing witness protection. Yet the romantic relics and coded love notes from Rob always seemed to find me eventually, materializing without any discernible trail at friends' homes or new workplaces, despite my best efforts to leave no forwarding address. How he managed to pierce through every firewall of security and anonymity became an obsession in itself, another gaslit question with no easy answers, constantly kneeling my unraveling sanity. What torments me most isn't the endless sleepless nights lying awake, startled by every creak and footstep outside my door. It's the sinking suspicion I could produce an entire storage locker's worth of paper trails and digital evidence documenting his intimidating, unrelenting tactics. Yet law enforcement would still never deem a credible threat worthy of serious intervention and restraint beyond a half-hearted warning or two to the perpetrator. Merely writing off another oversensitive female overreacting to some persistent, unchivalrous romantic delusion destined to fizzle out if she'd only had more patience, refusing to recognize the potentially combustible volatility of that mindset until it inevitably escalates beyond the point of no return. The emotional and psychological fallout from living through that turmoil still haunts me to this day. How could I have been so blind to those initial red flags glazed over by superficial niceties? Were there any clear signals I willfully ignored about what kind of person I was getting recklessly entangled with? Most harrowing of all, how does someone even begin attempting to recover and regain their ability to trust after staring into that obsessive abyss of romantic madness for months on end? In this arena, stories like mine aren't nearly as uncommon as people would hope, yet each serves as a solemn reminder to never underestimate the human capacity to lose one's sanity when faced with the cold sting of unrequited desire. I honestly should have seen the red flags from a mile away when my old buddy Jake randomly resurfaced after years of silence just to shamelessly play matchmaker. We weren't even that close back in the day, just dumb kids who ran in similar circles before graduating and drifting our separate ways. So the fact he seemed so weirdly insistent on setting me up with this amazing woman he knew through work without any real context or explanation seemed suspicious as hell right off the bat. Still, mid-30s and perpetually single, I tried not to be overly judgmental or let my guard down too easily. Us perma-bachelor types know all too well how desperate the struggle can feel swiping through the same stale local options every night until those dating profiles start blending together into one blurry vortex of mediocrity. So when Jake gassed this particular blind date up as some genuine rarity, an intellectual equal who shared a bizarre number of coincidental compatibility factors and seminal life experiences in common with me, I figured I'd give it a shot and at least stay open-minded before instinctively recoiling again. But from the very second Lisa walked through the dingy bar door where we'd agreed to meet, something almost magnetic stirred an inexplicably visceral force pulling me toward her. There was just this haunting familiarity woven into her casual mannerisms and movements that resonated deeply within some untapped reservoir of my subconscious in an indescribably eerie way. She had this effortless girl-next-door demeanor about her that felt equal parts warmly nostalgic and cosmically jarring, reminding me of people and places from my long-forgotten past, despite knowing with cast-iron certainty our paths had never crossed before that night. We made small talk over the initial knocking back of stout icebreakers, each of us admitting to the mild anxiety and awkwardness that usually accompanies blind setups if the chemistry is not quite firing out all cylinders right away. But with every passing second, it was like the cadence and timbre of her quasi-Midwestern vocal patterns tuned my internal frequencies to some encrypted channel on a subliminal dimension lurking beneath my conscious radar. An almost disquieting paradox where casual conversational affability and comforting presence seemed to burrow itself deeper into the marrow of my being, spreading warmth and long-dormant embers of recognition usually only awakened by sacred reunions with family or caregivers from the primal blanket of one's childhood origin story. As we waded deeper into the recitations of our respective journeys through quarter-life crisis and nomadic late-20s hustle chapters, I found myself slipping into a rapturous daze, unable to ignore the sense that the very fabric of her identity mirrored and looped back through seminal aspects of my own personal narrative in far too many unsettlingly uncanny patterns to chalk up as total coincidence. The disorienting stages of teenage rebellion, hastily assembled stretches drifting through random odd jobs for rent money or substance overindulgence, just for something to do wherever we washed ashore in those formless years. Every rising and falling inflection in her tone seemed to unlock buried pieces of my past, as if we were cosmically interlinked versus trading call and response rifts from astral planes galaxies apart. That's when she happened to mention something impossible to unhear, casually dropping the fact her nomadic journey began in the same nondescript rural Midwestern hamlet where I'd spent my most formative years. A cold, icy dread instantly constricted my breath as all the hairs on the back of my neck and forearms started recoiling in revulsed attention. Suddenly hypersensitized to any and every buried detail I might have missed while lost in our meandering horde. As an only child to strictly private parents who'd forever kept their family origins tightly confined, anything tracing back to that remote childhood zip code always triggered vague pangs of suspicion. The more she doled out impressively specific factoids about that particular region's unique arborisms and cultural quirks, the more ironclad her intimate familiarity with its lore became, too eerily credible to chalk up as amateur guesswork. I found myself growing increasingly queasy and distrusting my own instincts, wondering just how feeble my memory might truly be to forget I'd perhaps recited part of that childhood backstory to her without even realizing. Because the flirtatious momentum building between us had already ventured into an undeniably profound valley, accelerating way beyond the windy roads most first dates cautiously meandered down toward vulnerability and intimacy. When I finally mustered up the nerve to cautiously tread on the topic of family histories and hereditary backgrounds, that's when the anchor dropped once and for all, crushing all remaining oxygen from my lurching guts. Growing up as a ward of the state, a newborn castaway surrendered for adoption to the harsh Midwest wilderness on little more than an anonymous prayer and pinky promise. Lisa had virtually no insight into her biological lineage or genealogical forebears, aside from that sadly sparse origin story first referenced during the evening's small talk, which, in hindsight, makes every follicle on my body instinctively recoil in deeply seated revulsion. As her rustically accented riffs continued ricocheting between each fresh eruption of laughter and cheeky eye contact, the sickening implications pinballed along in parallel trajectories, rapidly resetting and recontextualizing every instant of flirtation and vulnerability we'd indulged over the evening into something epically more tainted and taboo. Was it possible, in some twisted metaphysical warp of family trees and generational missing branches, at this woman I'd been rapidly, shamefully catching legit feelings for over a few measly hours could somehow be linked to me on a chromosomal level through some long-severed, tragically unspoken trail of ancestral lineages and familial offshoots I knew nothing about. By the time our glasses emptied, I was a sweaty, stammering shell of a man coming completely disassembled at the molecular seams, utterly transfixed yet repulsed, desperately devouring her every movement like a spiritual succubus, while paradoxically fixating on the nearest emergency exit. Our rushed goodbyes and overarching air of awkwardness was my subconscious hitting the eject button before any further lines got even more irredeemably blurred. That gratuitously tight embrace dragging on for 1 or 12 excruciating Mississippis, too many as we reluctantly disengaged. The electricity of our inexplicable connection wrestling with the existential gut punches of deeply internalized taboo. Hey guys, sorry for interrupting, but just a quick announcement. First of all, if you're still listening, then you're amazing. Thank you for listening and supporting. Our team worked tirelessly day and night to produce these amazing stories for you. That's why we set up a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can show your support by generously donating a coffee or two to our team to keep us energized. It isn't much, but will surely go a long way. It's totally your choice, but would be absolutely amazing if you could. Again, thank you for your support. The link is in the bio and comments. Back to the stories. When Sarah first casually mentioned her passion for exploring alternative communities over dinner, I wrote it off as just another free-spirited California girl obsession. Maybe some new age yoga retreat or vegan commune promoting the usual hippy-dippy detox fads and consciousness raising. You know, the predictable spread of eccentric fringe movements that relentlessly lure in young, searching souls across Les trendier zip codes. Little did I realize in that moment, I'd just been handed the opening set of coordinates pointing toward a deep, dark rabbit hole from which there'd be no easy escape. Those initial few hours unfolded like any other standard first date, pleasant enough banter and conversational foreplay giving way to more personal anecdotes about our histories and philosophical outlooks on the world, as the evening's liquid courage loosened any inhibitions. Nothing too out of the ordinary red flag territory for a typical guy initiating entry into the City of Angels trademark buffet of new age oddballs, spiritual rebirths, and granola crunching third eye awakening stories. Just the usual colorful dusting of free spirit quirks you've sadly grown accustomed to after living adjacent to those hippie epizones for longer than you care to admit. But then our meandering chats kept inexplicably circling back to this enlightened community she vaguely referenced as her de facto extension of family, constantly singing their praises in breathless, luminous testimony, while still carefully deflecting anything too invasive about their inner rites, rituals, or mechanisms for initiation. At first, the hairs prickling on my neck were easily soothed by rationalizing it was just her usual misfit social circle of trust fund wanderers and cultural nomads to roll with between the latest vision quest or PO walkabout. That first undeniable gnaw of unease took hold when she just casually mentioned how this cloistered group existed almost as their own enigmatic subset on the fringes. Chasing a self-prescribed doctrine of disconnecting from the toxic matrix and living free from the depraved system, slowly infecting the collective human psyche and corrupting all its institutions. Her tight-lipped vagueness when pressed for any hard specifics on what any of that deliciously vague rhetoric actually meant in practice only fanned the flames of my suspicions about potentially wandering into extremist thought territory here. Still, I stubbornly held my tongue and self-assuredly assured myself this was likely just one more passing new age cult of personality Sarah would eventually age out of on down the line, like all her cosmic travels before. Driving her home after dinner, that's when the final other bathroom slipper of doubt finally dropped, smashing against the windshield in a grandiose mushroom cloud of no-going-back clarity that the quiet eccentric girl I'd been flirting with all night had undeniably undergone a self-actualized metamorphosis into raving ideological zealot. What it seemed like another predictable helping of areola girl hippy-dippy banter and free spirit affirmations abruptly metastasized into the inescapable reality she was a true believer, head over heels, obsessively proselytizing about this chosen family commune not through rose-colored spiritual lenses, but as her literal personification of enlightenment and long-prophesied salvation from the depraved, toxic forces oppressing all of humanity. I'll never shake the bone-deep unmooring I felt as any lingering pretext of our evening being a carefree get-to-know-you fling for settling casual sparks fell completely by the wayside in favor of Sarah's deranged clarion call toward what sounded more and more like an extinction-level doomsday cult's baptism by fire prophecies. The charged litany of buzzwords and conspiratorial vernacular escalated to the point. She flat out issued an ultimatum, forego all my material addictions and meaningless attachments in this waking life to join their ranks immediately or be doomed to suffer irreparably once the purification dawned to reset our species' ailing matrix for the interdimensional inheritors. At that point, any marginally lucid part of my primal survival instincts knew staying in that car with her even one more passing second defied all self-preservation at its core. I suddenly pictured being trapped in a hostage crisis on some remote compound, my own fracture lines manipulated and leveraged to entirely dissolve my tenuous grip on objective reality as I'd once known it. In what felt like a bizarro dream state trance, I dug deep and managed to calmly extract myself from her car with a series of empty promises to consider her impassioned enlightenment after giving it more sober thought. Of course, the second I touched pavement and knew I was unrestrained, those fight-or-flight reflexes that had been cryogenically frozen by confusion instantly thawed into a dead sprint. I pounded pavement for blocks in every direction, constantly craning over my shoulder until I was certain I'd ghosted off any map her unhinged cult could try mobilizing to track me down and ultimately apprehend me for reconditioning. That whole paranoia state lingered for weeks, every unfamiliar pedestrian passing a little too close haunting my peripheral vision. Even after I'd changed my routine, so many times my own friends couldn't keep up, just subconsciously looking for any sign my coordinates might have been inadvertently leaked. It really messed me up in ways I'm not sure I'll ever totally be able to disarm past the invasive aftershock still pulsing that lingering sixth sense for imminent spiritual abduction. Because ultimately, one of the most unsettling aspects of that whole shitshow, beyond just the human baseline terror of love bombing into an involuntary doomsday cult recruitment rev-up, was how it completely recontextualized my own defenses, identities, and reactionary protocols. Even after regaining agency, some deeply buried amphibian sector of my psyche couldn't shake the unrelenting notion that I'd somehow actually blacked out and envisioned the whole thing. That Sarah herself was just a personified projection sent by the simulation itself to psychologically goad me into awakening from the Matrix liturgical slumbers before universal integration into. It kicked off like any other blind date night, grabbing pregame drinks at one of those cozy, dimly lit neighborhood bars that always seemed like the neutral battleground for gut-checking if the spontaneous hinge match might eventually blossom into something more than a one and done. Haley ticked all the superficial boxes based on her profile: smart, successful, objectively attractive with what appeared to be a razor-sharp sense of humor to match mine T's for T's. Nothing too out of the ordinary red flag territory going by the usual online dating script. But once those opening cocktails hit our bloodstreams and her pupils dilated, that's when the first faint distress pulses started pinging my spidey senses that something here may be slightly off. Not necessarily in an overt, she's wearing someone else's face as a mask kind of way, but subtle gut-nudging dissonance like radio static quietly bleeding through otherwise pleasant small talk frequencies. An unsettling aura I simply couldn't pinpoint the source of in that initial pregame phase. It started with Haley casually mentioning some light personal anecdotes and dating war stories from her not-too-distant romantic past to keep our conversational energies flowing. Harmless enough icebreaker stuff, the kind of perfunctory oversharing we've all been guilty of at some point when struggling to find common ground with someone new. Everyone loves bonding over the mutual failures and faceplants paving their winding path to the present moment, right? Except in Haley's case, these ostensibly relatable greatest hits and personal admissions didn't arrive in healthy, digestible servings. The painful oversharing came barreling through in a torrential downpour, flood sirens wailing louder with each passing gulp as she got progressively drunker on her own tragic verbal exhaust. What started as a sprinkling of one-off anecdotes celebrating her newly single status pivoted at light speed into a linear illustration of every private argument, intimacy, in-law snafu, and eventual demise, stacking up like crashed cars, totaling the slowly smoldering wreckage of her 7-year relationship. At first, I found myself listening intently out of gentlemanly courtesy, giving her plenty of leeway for any nervously meandering lead-ups to circle back around from the painful rain clouds of recent dissolution and acrimonious breakup storylines. But when that reset point never arrived, when Haley just hellbent steamrolled through entire sagas of Black Mirror-esque dramatic foreplay and coitus interruptus, like an Iliadic epic recounting every slight from the petty grievance pantheon, that's when I first felt the oxygen getting sucked from my very own lungs, too. Because rather than present it all as a memoir of hard-won self-actualization or wistful stepping stone lessons through the valley towards eventual greater horizons, these stories were still glaringly unresolved and freshly scurrying her psyche with each passing retelling. The more Haley ricocheted between cold-shoulder baggage dispatches from her clearly depressive purgatory state, the more my spirit guides sounded the internal klaxon alerts trying to jolt me fully conscious before getting conscripted as an unlicensed rebound therapist on some warped drama triangle mission. Just when I thought the pungently oversharing dumpster confessional couldn't discomfit me any deeper down the rabbit hole, the final 16-ton heel drop arrived, wrapped in a disarmingly casual /euphemism about how she technically hadn't ended things with her parasitic life partner just yet after all. That's when the transmission overloaded and decoupled from the rest of the drivetrain, sending my central nervous system into a seizing code red panic spiral upon realizing I've been love-bombed into the crosshairs of some IRL Crimson Peak psycho haunter's endless night carousel. Because suddenly, every discordant note she'd struck over the course of our spiraling date, every meandering rabbit trail of intimate memoir seemingly weaponized for purposes of establishing common trauma, realigned at warp speed, like plasma exoturning coils whipping around my chakras, sucking me into the intractable event horizon of her torrid, gaslit abuse saga. The twisted cry for help pantomimes, the smokescreen lifeboat ditches flirting with me as a hue and medium for conjuring and exorcising her demonic baggage attachments. I could practically smell the burnt wick odor of mayhem in the making as she kept pouring more and more second-hand emotional napalm over the parched internal forests, praying for any external rain. Much to my dumbfounded panic, Haley damn near warded me in real time as the evening progressed, Lovecrafting her own personal sigils and glyphs for beckoning primordial psychosexual furies straight out of relationship purgatory straight into the physical realm of our date. Like she convinced herself the simple act of my being the listening acquitted carte blanche to use my very existence as some blank spirit bored for channeling out her own innermost microfissures, howling for outside arbitration. At certain points, I could have sworn I caught the inky black tendrils of hell smoke trailing her every glassy-eyed blink and far-off thousand-yard stare swoons. Like those trauma scars weren't locked away as scabs from distant yesteryears at all. They remained eternally open, oozing slipstreams, cross-pollinating her every thought, perpetually manifesting abstract hauntings waiting to fully incarnate through whatever vulnerable human conduit stumbled into her sphere of energetic influence next. Which, of course, happened right on devilishly prophesied cue the moment a frantic buzzing from her purse disrupted whatever deep-state fugue she'd been spelunking around inside. An electronic call to conjure from the official outer realm-event horizon itself. The way Haley's eyes rolled back in their sockets at first vibration still haunts me to this day, as if some malformed skeletal poltergeist wafted up from the exact underworld crisis nexus she'd been psychically tapped into all night, beckoning her energy upwards towards the bar's exits for a grand cosmic reconvergence. In the nanosecond before her sentient aura drifted away, I caught the unmistakable inklings of grim recognition flashing across whatever microchards of self still glinted behind those dilated portals. She knew exactly what that ringtone harbingered. Some charred tentacle of her eldritch demon parasite's final pull to fully drag what few tattered remnants of her psyche might remain down into the sulpits forever for eternal damnation. In the Uberhome, all that remained was the anchored pit in my stomach bearing witness to whatever unknowable dark energies she kept swirling around in ritual subjugation towards. Those uncanny valley throat squeezes when your synapses try rationalizing whether an evening was simply lived in with a particularly unstable person careening into reactive psychosis, or if your very soul had been temporarily possessed by the residual haunter essence of someone's undoing, parasitic soul bonding with their profane beloved from the cosmic outrealms. Either way, those smokescreens and backmasking rituals seared unsettling visions my lizard brain may never unsee. All I know is moving forward, any prospective dating profiles hinting toward unearthly energies or metaphysics existing adjacent to our plane will automatically get swiped into oblivion. I've brushed up against the infinite hellscapes enough for several reincarnation cycles worth of debriefings already. No need courting more accidental conscriptions into the next astral cult's soul harvest until I'd atoned and properly sanctified from Haley's eternal ritual. Right from those first few innocuous moments of pre-gate small talk, I really wish I'd paid closer attention to the faint prickles of intuition kneeling the back of my mind. Looking back now, there were microscopic breadcrumbs of disquiet sprinkled throughout, like how insistently Eric pushed for us to meet up at this dimly lit hole-in-the-wall bar instead of a busier, more public setting. Or the subtle ways his otherwise warm, charismatic demeanor would temporarily cloud over whenever I redirected any questions probing a little too deep into his personal life and background for a total stranger. Tiny raised flags about potential control impulses and rigid boundaries around selective self-editing that any reasonably wizened person should have heeded as their first internal warning sirens. But I didn't, stubbornly ignoring those intestinal niggles in hopes of not living up to the cliché of that paranoid girl who always assumes the worst in people. So I pressed onward, sipping my bourbon neat and making what I convinced myself was pleasant first-date conversation as Eric dazzled with his finely curated tapestry of travel stories and winking banter. On a purely superficial level, the persona he portrayed ticked all the conventional tall, dark, and brooding charm boxes, Intelligent, well-read, with a roguish hint of understated toughness peeking through those steely eyes. Sure, he occasionally flexed off-putting flashes of aggro volatility, like furiously sputtering under his breath every time our poor, overworked server flubbed a minor request. But I wrote those moments off as nothing more than ugly American id momentarily leaking through the impeccably lacquered veneer he spent so long buffing to a dull shine for our opening waltz. From the second we closed our tabs and those first brisk evening gusts swept through the sidewalk seam between the crumbling brick facades, though, that's when the first distortions in our wavelengths started slowly decoring any false senses of connective soul bond Eric's love-bombing overtures had initially tinted my lenses with. As we ambled down those abandoned streets in pursuit of his hyped-up new craft cocktail spot, the subtlest shifts in unspoken energy commenced, from my casually looping my arm around his elbow eliciting an instantaneous recoil catastrophe to his whole body language array transforming from playfully at ease to overly hardened, even accusatorily hostile if only refracted through the peripherals. At first, I simply wrote those radically diverging personal force fields off to opening night physical intimacy jitters, or maybe Eric still subconsciously wrestling with anxieties around appearing a certain brand of well-adjusted alpha for his fresh face. But the longer we wandered down that perpetually elongating road to nowhere as the garish city glow dimmed behind us, the more unsettling inklings of primitive animal instincts started crackling over my AM/FM bandwidths. Some panther-faced psyche deep underneath all of Eric's projected airs and conversationalist dazzle was rapidly slip-sliding its way to the surface. Very likely the truer baseline frequency he actually operated on when not performing his memorized song and dance routine for fresh quarry. My fight-or-flight nerves lit up like Sputnik receiving its launch codes, body seemingly preparing for an imminent siege to come even as my cerebral cortex dumbly clung to hopeful denial. I could almost physically smell his dilated pheromones projecting some barely covert machismo dominance test looming on the horizon. Which is exactly when, after politely suggesting we redirect course, since he'd seemed to misremember where this vaunted cocktail bodega was even situated, Eric's switch finally flipped into a primordial gear, completely shed of the affable guy-next-door cloaking he'd been sporting all evening. His jawline tightening, hardened eyes squinting to sinister slits, while upper lip slowly curled into the faintest whisper of a snarl. Every neuron inside me jangled in unison as my hypervigilance antenna received Eric's latest biocommunique at full translation. Cornered predator springing its trap, ready to bring the full measure of its grotesquerie to bear. While I frantically calmed for any disarming gestures or olive branches to extend, Eric started slowly encroaching from a cautious distance away, his lumbering shuffle suddenly catapulting forward with hostile intent like he picked up sense of weakness in my increasingly viscous atmosphere. In an out-of-body flash, every primal instinct informed me with profound certainty that the situation had already pitched perilously sideways into sincerely unsafe territory. This was a person melting completely through the lava fissures of their own stability, graduating from merely exuding vague, something's off energied, to now feeling downright imminently threatened. As Eric's whole aura transmutated into a figure of genuine moral peril looming ever closer under those pastoral street lamps, I bolted the first path of egress available with every pico impulse, screaming to not become the next statistic. Smiling wide in buoyant denial, I quick-spun 180 on my heels and picked up the mother of aimless strolls back in the direction of imminent safety, every cell ricocheting at code red resiliency levels while still spraying shine and courtesy in Eric's somber direction. I'll never forget the sudden feel of his lasering between my shoulder blades roasting divots through every confidence and facade. Sincerely dangerous proximity verging on cheetah-stalking distance even as the public streets came peeking into view. It wasn't until I hit the front stoop of my building's entrance that the tension cords between realities finally ripped completely. Daring one last look over my shoulder in the tinted lobby security window, I caught the sight of Eric unrepentantly trailing after me at a brisk, singular pace, gone beyond staging his fixation behind a socially couthed mask. The moment I came through that outside door into the inner sanctum, his face ceased even feigning the pretense of finding our evening fixable, finally allowing itself to smash its contents out into the molten glass fire infernal it had been all along. In the span of a few flickering heartbeats, the shrieking drunken howls and curses rained down through the corridors as Eric commenced his full shelling of the entrance barricades, trying to smash his way through to interior. Suddenly, my doofy neighbor Jim, the usually sleepy retiree who never batted an eye at any 2 a.m. drunken shenanigans, emerged in a Cro-Magnon battle stance from the stairwell. His internal howitzer cello doors swung open to return full primal hostilities on Eric without hesitation, commencing the full whirlwind of violence and explosive struggle my memory will forever experience only in kaleidoscopic freeze frames, separated by cosmic smoke plumes. The only lasting visions I'll retain with any crisp fidelity are Jim roaring to stay inside and lock all entrances, and that disturbing crimson splotch arsing across the building's outer concrete stoop, where the battleground ultimately calmed. Eric nowhere to be found alongside it. To this day, I have no tangible recollection of their actual physical clash resolving, just strobing imprints of brawling male desperation, of hostilities boiled over for which I'll never comprehend the full context or motive forces. I should have realized something was off from the moment he slid into my DMs with that overly flattering opening line. Between the intimate details he sprinkled in about things I'd posted ages ago, and how effortlessly the compliments rolled off his virtual tongue, part of me couldn't help but wonder, was this guy for real or just another toxic expert love-bombing artist fresh out of the gate? As a perpetually single gal leery of modern dating's potential battlefields, those gut instincts flash-flagging any potential red alerts on the reg. But for once, I decided to lean into the possibility of a genuine connection over pages of scrutinous suspicion. Big mistake. Jake presented himself as the total package in those opening exchanges. Judging by the hiking and outdoor adventuring pics he eagerly volunteered, he was obviously an adrenaline junkie cut from starter pack boyfriend cloth. Rugged, tan, casually introspective in that earthy, let's ditch our phones for a week and just exist kind of way. His freewheeling answers to questions about passions and aspirations sounded almost too good to be true, echoing an eerily accurate approximation of everything I claimed to look for in an ideal partner. Maybe I was simply at the stage of desperation where any unicorn who seemed too good to be true also felt dangerously plausible compared to the smorgasbord of dime a dozen dude senior ETM. Or maybe Jake's boyish charm and relentlessly sunny positivity on our nightly phone convo started charming away my foundational skepticism one laugh at a time. Regardless, it took less than a month of gushy back and forth before our emotional intimacy leveled up from strangers to anxiously awaiting our first in-person encounter like eager teenagers. Of course, the signs were present all along that I was walking face first into an ambush of deception. There were the ever-so-slight inconsistencies in details between Jake's flowing anecdotes that a true diehard world traveler would never flub. The mysterious resistance to ever hopping on even brief FaceTime calls, no matter how solid our rapport grew, always resorting to some crackling, weak signal excuse about being deep in the wilderness. Little things that raised momentary suspicion internally before being swept aside by his proactively reassuring demeanor about how much he despised modern social media artifice. By the time our magical first date finally rolled around, I'd already binged enough seasons of Catfish to know I was potentially careening full tilt towards delusion. But those nagging worries got shelved the instant Jake arrived and fell into an earnest embrace, one that felt so genuine and practiced, aiming every ounce of attentiveness directly into my smitten gaze. He looked and carried himself exactly like the wilderness spirit animal from his carefully curated photos. Down to the slightest lilt in his animated cadence, and that subtle campfire musk clinging to his flannel, it was like Seth Rogen cosplaying Wooderson to award-worthy theatrical perfection. The initial 2 hours felt as dreamy as any heightened movie romance, full of clever repartee volleyed back and forth between two soul-searchers reveling in their unexpected mind meld. Our conversation drifted into that deceivingly safe space where you surrender your filters and inhibitions without even realizing, freely discussing topics usually considered third-rail unmentionables on standard first dates. For those fleeting moments, I couldn't shake the self-assured conviction this had to be the long-prophesied universe manifesting my narrowly defined dream partner into existence, tailored down to the molecule. Until suddenly, That multiverse collapse with a sickening lurch back into the twisted reality of what was increasingly unspooling is a malicious grand deception. Whether it was the off-kilter reaction when I referenced one of his own allegedly autobiographical anecdotes, or the uneasy glimmers of uncertain panic flickering behind his eyes when faced with any deviations from the curated script. But that facade of sincerity finally faltered and crumbled away in palpable increments. As more and more microfissures started spiderwebbing, exposing hollow cornerstones of Jake's entire existence, he convinced me were sculpted from granite-resolute truths. I felt my own pulse quicken to that involuntary state of hypervigilant panic one reserves for legitimately dangerous situations. Where previously my focus had been siloed laser-locked on following his spellbinding oration, now the background details swarmed into ultra-sharp relief. And scene by agonizing scene, I started noticing just how many premeditated stagecraft details had been propped into our environment to manipulate my senses into believing a carefully constructed fable beyond my own vulnerability towards wishful thinking. The fingernail scratches on the leather portfolio folder he accidentally left on the booth, conveniently exposed to flash an intolerably believable supporting documentation skeleton for buttressing the compounding confabulations spilling from his every pore. The barrage of perfectly timed text buzzes from different numbers spontaneously arriving every few minutes with names casually mentioned before, feigning the illusion of an interconnected social fabric existing off in the periphery. The minimalist luck talisman detangling from his wrist that provided a momentary shiver glint to slyly distract and derail my suspicions every time my brow started slightly furrowing deeper into interrogation mode. Even in those unacceptably cringeworthy moments when my barrage of deflating pushback finally forced Jake back onto his heels. Those supposed miscalculations and inconsistencies, his mystique seamlessly waved away with apologies while subtly implying I was overanalyzing some minor oversight on the exhaustive backstory Bible he'd authored over the past God knows how many weeks of meticulous preparation. I should have bolted right then and there before any more of my oxygen and personal dignity got pillaged by the depraved mechanics of this violating charade. Instead, I shamefully stuck around to quite literally watch my otherworldly dream partner disintegrate before my very eyes. Every aspect of his persona cascading away layer by contemptible layer until nothing remained except for some hollowed-out facsimile naggingly overcompensating with robotic charm routines, while toxically dazzling me for showing understandable human distress at being so systematically deceived, manipulated, and psychologically violated. As the waiter mercifully rushed our check before the cringe quotient spiraled into black hole territory, I remember glancing down at my own clammy reflection in the silverware. The embarrassing hollowness of someone who'd let themselves get so utterly enraptured by an artificial fantasy porn plot to the point they venture out their own reality reservations. In that moment of pristine clarity, staring back at the haunted visage I didn't recognize as my own, it dawned on me with mortifying humiliation. I really should have heeded those faint prickles of intuition the moment that self-professed hinky sashayed through the hotel bar's entrance. Not just the bizarre unconventionality of someone fully grown choosing to go by such a juvenile nickname, but the overtly coy, mischievous way she announced it while looking me dead in the eyes, almost daring me to question the absurdity, sent dusty finger trail whispers of unease scuttling across my subconscious from the get-go. Looking back now, I realize that one tiny microaggression was all the context clue I'd need about the entire evening's tailspin into darkness quickly approaching. But in that precise moment, caution surrendered to the sensual whirlwind's pinky artfully conducted from her ruby-red command center. Even before greeting me with an air kiss feathering both cheeks, she exuded a bewitching aura of bubbly charisma powerful enough to steadily liquefy any residual misgivings. Every delicately pursed syllable and granular gesture oozed the poise of someone who thoroughly studied the neurolinguistic maps to human psychology's dopamine hallways, carefully laying groundwork for a mind-hijacking none of us marked targets rarely anticipate coming. Over those initial vodka tonics, Pinky gently grazed the conversation's reins by issuing a meticulously calculated stream of commonplace getting-to-know-you questions. But the magic lay in how she'd furtively lace each one with subliminal hypnotic tendrils disguised as thoughtful engagement, needling just specific enough to subconsciously prompt vulnerable glimpses into my personal anecdotes and biographical facets without ever realizing I'd fallen into a synthetic report trance. a dreamy haze of back and forths that felt honest and easygoing while deftly steering towards her covertly premeditated directions all along. While my incident recollections remain fittingly hazy, I'm certain there arrived some indiscernible point of no return where the sensation of falling cessated entirely, replaced by abject vertigo and dizzying signs. Something metaphysical had surreptitiously sabotaged my interior navigational systems beyond the usual intoxication inertia. An unmistakable ventriloquist frisson rippling through my biorhythms from profoundly deeper layers of altered consciousness. At first, the sensory distortions manifested through innocuous enough eromorphosis betrayals. Half-awake reverie trances where simple spatial geometry warped and liquefied, menacingly distending all surrounding textures into something closer to viscous mirages than empirically codified matter. Mescaline pinwheels comprised of shadows, lips, and Pinky's fluttering eyelash hypnosis spinning mandala spirals around an ever-tightening vortex that drank whatever ethereal lucidity remained inside me. Multiple occasions of violent head rushes punching me cross-eyed, and wondering whether I'd been spiked or inadvertently overdosed on my medication stuff. Before coherently realizing what malevolent triggers had been flipped, the reality thermostat steadily got cranked down to Arctic permafrost levels. Bizarre ideations and false awakenings, where my atrophying avatar staggered through some neo-Cambrican hotel labyrinth's endless crimson corridors. Brackish black chills silently shrieking for release from the invasive body horror on a molecular level. Fitful night tremors where my essence became an inanimate mannequin slumped across a concave of ichor while Pinky's incorporeal succubus conductor frolicked nearby, merging into blanched geysers of ectoplasmic atrocity. By the apogee of that metaphysical devastation cycle, I'm fairly certain my bioelectrical field generators had already well shorted out whatever failsafe breakers connected me to waking consensus reality. Instead, I become a terminal sleepwalker trapped navigating realms of hellish lucidity my simian brain could barely begin encoding in tertiary storage banks, let alone remember upon any hypothetical reintegration to the everyday theater we accept as objective. What I staunchly clung onto throughout each plummeting synapse into the next downwards unknown. That some elemental spark within my psychophysical makeup still pumps stubborn enough to flare insistent dire warnings about the profane manipulations actively unfolding, all courtesy of Pinky's tender mesmeric machinations. Progressively paralyzing intimations that this violation transcended any rudimentary date rape or petty scam premise, but rather manifesting something intergalactically more primordial and apocalyptic to the membrane cells comprising my sense of individuated cohesion. Eventually, that panicking ember must have glowed supernaturally radiant enough to penetrate the ceremonial dimnesses enshrouding my own inner right's existential crossroads. As suddenly as all previous spatial fossils melted away entirely, raw howling sensorium whiplash, seizing navigation from the muscle memory death mass puppying my mortal remains only seconds beforehand. A jarring hard system restore forcing spontaneous emergency reboot back into the astringent banalities of terrestrial four-dimensional grids and algebra. Consciousness coalescing in surges like rebooting biosomatic machinery whirring to life anew, every neuron's gamma Zavin exosphere North Star blaze feverishly recalibrating through dense ionic miasma shrouds. When next the atmosphere pressures equalized enough to manifest baseline Cartesian surroundings, I barely recognized this synthetic bodily hologram husk reactivating as my own. Just some frail meat avatar excreted from intestinal analogs and abandoned on the moist carpet of an unfamiliar holodecked reality, no longer host to the usual ethereal propriety which piloted it through the mortal coil up until that point. Only upon frantically grappling a compartment spare of personal effects did the horrific extent of Pinky's invasive transgression become undeniably apparent. She hadn't just dozed and discombobulated my vitals for purposes of petty larceny. This went far beyond breaking any social or spiritual contracts over a first aid gone awry in the sprawl. No, what traces of peripheral recollection remained permanently etched itself, as confirmation my entire essence had endured the dehumanizing deconstruction of forced egress from this continuum secure sandbox and into some unvarnished abyss far more hostile and anti-entropic, Her vector sigils sensed their target specimen's defenses compromised, surging forth to occupy and subsequently evict my core autonomy by any means necessary once the interdimensional bypasses into headier ontological planes were successfully hijacked. Whatever lurked at the nadir of that seamless transformation, whether some unanticipated triggering psychological failsafe kicked in for expelling the invading possessor algorithms, or I just flatlined out despite their attempts at calibrating my corporeal machinery into a newly sustainable conduit, remains unilluminated to this very day. Suffice to say, any quixotic identities still wrestling for dominion rapidly decoupled at that ultimate threshold boundary, resonating out in muddled differential harmonics across dimensionally sundry elsewheres, until universal forces washed away all persistent congruencies. So I bend reality back into atheistic material bins, filing away any fantasies of archaeonic demons, vampiric biochemical marauders, or psychotropic exotic matter beyond the cosmic sensorium's palace guardrails. Pinky couldn't have been anything other than an extremely skilled life hacker and predatory dynamist armed with extremely potent pharmaceutical poison. Because otherwise, I had to start admitting the undeniable corrosive effects of playing host as some unauthorized immigrant unified across the fragile consensus hallucination collectively persists within. And nobody wants to embark on that paradigm shake to their cozy blind bloodspot bluffs before absolutely forced into its undoing. I really should have taken it as a red flag when Maddie suggested meeting up at this hole-in-the-wall Italian joint tucked away in the shadier part of town. Don't get me wrong, I'm all about discovering those off-the-beaten-path hidden gems most people overlook. But based on her Instagram photos, she gave off more upscale wine and dine vibes than someone who frequented places with bicyclists chained up outside and bullet holes in the concrete facade. Still, I went with an open mind. Maybe she valued ambience and home-style authenticity over swanky atmospheres. So I found myself at this dimly lit, graffiti-splattered mom and pop establishment that looked like it hadn't seen a renovation since Vinny and Polly were on kitchen duty back in '86. Frankly, the nervous flutter in my gut from just walking in the door should have been recognized as my intuition's first warning flare. But I ignored it, stubbornly convincing myself not to judge a book by its dilapidated cover. The moment Maddie arrived looking like a total smoke show, though, those initial hesitations melted away. Her smile radiated pure sunshine, offsetting the drab dinnery vibe instantly. We hugged, exchanged pleasantries, normal first date stuff. Our waiter promptly arrived, demeanors all understandably chipper, figuring he'd get a decent tip off a young, flirtatious couple for once. But as he handed us oversized laminated menus stained with decades of marinara splashes, I noticed Maddie's entire disposition shift in an instant. Where there were bright eyes and dimpled grins just seconds before, suddenly her head hung low, shoulders tensed up in this overtly uncomfortable hunch. She quietly muttered something under her breath that sounded awfully like damn it the moment that greasy menu hit the table in front of her. That's when the internal alarm started clanging. Instincts signaling this date had officially stopped being casual and pivoted directly into much more fraught territory. Sure enough, over the few minutes it took for our waiter to circle back, Maddie seemed to retreat further into this morose, almost fearful trance state. She barely looked up from staring blankly at the table, eyes glazing over like a spooked animal entering shutdown mode. When our server returned asking if we were ready to order, that's when the other shoe finally dropped with a sickening thud I heard even over the ambient clatter of plate and silverware. Without any preamble, this burly, disheveled-looking dude emerged from out of nowhere, shoving the waiter aside and straight-arming his way into our personal space so aggressively I nearly tumbled out of my chair. Even at first glance, you could see the blotchy red tint of rage pulsing in his face, practically frothing at the mouth already. Immediately he turned his menacing glare right at Maddie, 2 years of bitterness, jealousy, and pent-up resentment unleashing itself directly on her currently paralyzed form. The aggressive shouting and finger-pointing started instantly, detailing in graphic terms how she was an unfaithful lying whore, and with some silly idiot new boy toy being laughed at behind my back. It didn't take much piecing together to realize he was Maddie's recently discarded ex making one of those embarrassingly unhinged public displays of hostility that every sane person dreads inadvertently stumbling into. But no sooner than you could process what was actually unfolding, The aggression quickly turned on me as well. In the same breath as demanding affirmation of whether I'd known about him the whole time, he started peppering in thinly veiled threats about ensuring I'd regret ever going near his girl, rage flexing those bulging biceps, practically ready to pummel me right then and there. Maddie just sat frozen beside me, face buried in her hands as the embarrassment overcame whatever spark she'd arrived with. And she hadn't essentially dissociated into her own private shame realm. At first glance, you'd assume I was the one responsible for dragging this supposedly reformed maniac into her orbit all over again. Admittedly, the terror paralyzed me from reacting much at all myself. I just sat there like a deer in headlights, praying this enraged bull would somehow burn itself out. But that only seemed to embolden the menacing, making it clear he would likely not leave until some recompense had been paid. Either in broken dishware and collateral damage there, or with my faculties if I ended up on the wrong end of his swing radius. Thankfully, the poor waiter managed to maintain his composure enough to subtly hit an emergency call button, because within what felt like minutes, squad cars pulled up outside with strobe lights illuminating the entire rundown strip. By the time 2 husky beat cops strode through the doors, Beaufort here was already well on his way, getting preemptively restrained and shoved into the alley for processing. I won't pretend like I wasn't still shaking from the whole traumatic episode, but at least there was some measure of swift justice restored. The calming officers even offered to escort Maddie to her vehicle safely just to avoid any chance of further incident while she was clearly still frazzled to the core. For my part, the only silver linings I could try mustering in that stunned moment of disbelief was gratefulness for making it out of there completely unscathed physically, and that the worst of it seemed to pass quickly enough before anything could truly spiral into the stuff of long-term mental anguish. I'm sure there's some pessimistic voices scolding that everything could have been avoided by simply listening to my gut instinct about the initial venue sketchiness. But hey, if nothing else, the surreal experience definitely gives me a perspective-shattering story to repeatedly dissect and analyze for all the bizarre details left swirling unanswered from that night.
Thanks for listening in. If you like these stories and want to hear more, then please subscribe and like and support this new channel. We have more stories for you to listen to.